Okay, good morning, afternoon now maybe, everyone. Nice to see you all here, and I'd like to thank James for inviting me to talk today, and I hope this will be of interest or of use to some of you to some extent, and I'm very happy to take questions as well about any aspect of what I talk about. So what I am going to talk about is the life, or maybe more so the afterlife, of the HEA-funded Irish Women in Work Oral History project that we undertook some years ago. I just want to acknowledge other members of the project team that worked with me on that project: Maureen, my colleague in Applied Social Studies, Marion Elders and Claude O'Driscoll, who also work in UCC. And I'd also like to acknowledge the support we got with archiving the material that was provided by a friend and colleague, Sarah Goke, who is a History and Digital Arts and Humanities graduate from UCC and now works and lives in the United States, but is still involved in the Oral History Network of Ireland. So, to give you a little bit of background to this project, basically two of us in Applied Social Studies had the idea that wouldn't it be nice to do an oral history project that engaged with older women about their working lives. Largely, we were looking at the period of the 1930s to the 1960s. There was a very specific reason for that. We felt that this generation of women over that period of time was largely cast as a fairly quiescent kind of generation of women who, suffered the marriage bar, who, were seen as not revolutionary women like the women that came before them or the women that came after them. But we were also very interested in finding out, how do they engage in the world of work at a time where there was a marriage bar in existence, how they found married life when they couldn't work outside of marriage, and, how did they perceive this now, years later, as their own daughters and granddaughters are growing up, and what is their take on their experience over that period of time. So we put out a call, and women self-selected and came forward and answered that call for interviewees, so they were keen themselves to tell their story. Some, were reluctant to the degree that they were a little bit concerned about, have I anything important to say, or is there any value in what I have to say? But we very much wanted to focus this project not on the great women, but the ordinary everyday women who went about their lives. So basically the data that we collected in the course of that project would have involved the recorded interview that we conducted with each woman. We did have a transcript of that interview. We took a photograph of them in the context of their working lives that they gave to us, that they donated to the project. And we also took a photograph of them at the time of interview. And we also asked them if they had any memorabilia or ephemera, around their working life, that if they were happy to donate that to us or to give it to us for the purpose of an exhibition, we would be very grateful. Just to say that we planned from the outside to create an archive. We wanted to make this material available to others. We wanted to share the material in as much as we could. So right from the get-go, we basically decided to look for consent or for agreement for that particular purpose. Obviously, very many women did, and some women had reservations about archiving and chose not to. But we did plan it with that in mind. And we also created a website where, as part of that website, we had the archive. And again, it was with the idea that these women and their families and in the wider community, they could access this material through the website. So just to explain a little bit about oral history, I'm sure you're familiar, but I suppose what is key really to oral history is the idea of a video recorded or audio recorded interview and the preservation of the recording, not the transcript, but really the recording of the interview for further reference and further use. And I suppose at the time that we were doing this project, it was the late 1990s, early 2000s, we were aware that the digital era was presenting new opportunities for giving a focus to the orality or the orality, in other words, the speaking and the listening. And that was really, that's at the heart of oral history, but it was also at the heart of what we wanted to do. We weren't so focused on the transcripts, like many of us are as researchers, but very much on hearing and on listening to what the women had to say, and also how people tell their stories, and recognising that there's a lot to be gained by understanding the process of that. At the time, we also secured agreement with the university library that they would take the material once the project was finished, that they would archive it for us. So I can't do any presentation without giving you a little bit of a taster of what kind of material we gathered. So this is Mary Tapp, who was from Bandon, and Mary is talking about starting out life as a poetry instructor. That was her job, and I'm just going to give you a little taster of it.
Could you tell me a little bit about your working life, please?
I qualified in 1945, and my first appointment was obtained by candidating members of the Limerick County Commission on Agriculture, and then I was appointed on a temporary basis. And I reported from work to their office in Limerick, and I was sent out to Kilmallock to work that area without any sort of an introduction to people, to places, to anything, just sort of find my own way and to be found. I didn't have a car at the time, I was cycling, and I bought a bicycle for £19, and I did meet one of the eggs out there who taught me how to fill up a weekly diary, and gave me an introduction to a few people in the area. Then I was asked, that was about the only direction I got, to do a series of classes in Philistine. I was frightened out of my wits with the idea of standing up in front of an audience, because there was no prior training except in the Munster Institute. Just you had to give a lecture to your own students, and these were a body of women. I mean, actually ICA that I remember. I'm not quite sure where they were founded from, but they were an audience. They were available in the local vocational school, and I gave them my talk, and I thought, this can never happen to me again. It can never be a first time. But it went down very well, and when it was there was a series of lectures. They asked me back then to do about 4 or 5 of them, and they gave me a present of a writing case when I finished, which I thought made me into the Oakter on a Heron or something. But that was the first sort of break-up in confidence, the first sort of intimation of confidence that I could do the job.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked with them in that area. Then I was transferred to various parts of County Limerick. I did that for Fournhams in West Limerick, I was in Foynes, I was in Newcastle West, various towns there. Not exactly on a lecture circuit, but it was, as the Chief Agricultural Officer, decided where one should be or not. But the burning ambition of all of us at the time was to get a permanent post, which I did in Cavan. I do remember my first month's wages, which were very, very good considering the circumstances at the time, were £23 5 and 8 pence. That was about it until I got transferred to Cavan.
Mm-hmm. And did you grow up in Limerick?
No, I grew up to Tipperary.
In Tipperary.
Just over the border, just about 3 miles in the border.
And what did your parents do?
Farmers, they were farmers.
They were farmers. And did you have many siblings?
There were 8 of us in the family, and 3 boys and 5 girls.
So quite a large family.
Quite a large family, yes. Mm-hmm.
And did any of members of your family immigrate?
Just one, but not from the 1960s. Well, I had 2 sisters nuns, and whether you recall what they did, they were abroad. Whether that's immigration or not, I expect it is it?
I suppose, yes.
Yes, I mean, if they left the country. In that sense, yes, one brother went to England and lived in London all his life. And the nuns there travelled all over the place.
Right. And would it have been a comfortable period of growing up for you, financially in that?
Not really. But it wasn't poverty-stricken, but there was no surplus of money there. But you would hand me down to, at least I certainly had from my sisters who were older. Your treats were few and far between, money-wise.
Okay, so it just gives you a sense of the kind of material we gathered, which was largely about people's working lives.
Could you tell me?
Sorry. So it just gives you a sense of the website of the project. For example, this is what it looked like. We had given a small token to each woman who participated of St. Bridget's Cross, just to show our appreciation. And this was the website we got designed at the time. It was hosted in our school and in the university. And I suppose, it was our effort, to do things a little bit democratically, to share the outputs of a project, to allow the community to be able to listen to these stories in that context, and also to share our publications so that, again, the women or the participants could access those publications as well. And then I suppose we started to run into problems or issues. The first of those, I suppose, was in relation to the external academic who evaluated the project when we had completed the project. And of course, she had pointed out that we had looked for a space or a place to archive the material as a result of the project, and that hadn't been found. We were getting very clear indications at this point that the university would not be in a position to host the material, to make it available, to store it for us as such. So we were beginning to wonder, were we ever going to find a kind of permanent home really for this data that we had collected, and were we ever going to honour the promises that we had actually made? So because people were using the material, NUIG came forward, for example, and gave us a small bit of funding to address broken links on the website, to ensure that we could keep the website up to date and usable for a period of time. And so that was really useful to us. But then that ran into problems because UCC told us that they were going to be standardising the website, right across all the different colleges and units and whatever, and that there was really no place for our website anymore, that it didn't fit with the look and what they wanted. So in that context, the website had become obsolete. And, it became obvious to us that we had no long-term archival solution really for the project, and that this was becoming very, very unlikely at that particular point in time. So I suppose I did hear one of the seminars, and there was a talk about interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity and serendipity. And this was a little bit of serendipity for us that we attended. We were part of an oral history network here in the university, and in 2015, other colleagues organised a symposium, and we went along to that symposium. And at that, I had a conversation at break time and knew slightly Sarah Goke at the time. And Sarah, because she had an appreciation for oral history and was a digital arts and humanities graduate, and said, look, I'd be willing to help you to archive the material or to look at finding a solution in relation to this material. So that was great, and we got a bit of a kickstart, and we decided to apply for the UCC Strategic Fund, which was seed money really to get things going again. And at that time we had kind of 4 key objectives. One was to look at the possibility of setting up a sound archive in UCC. The other one was to look at 2 oral history collections, our own, that had an online presence. And the other one was Pierce McHenry and Breda Gray's project on an oral history project on people who stayed in Ireland at periods of high migration. And that project also had an online presence. So we were looking to see, could we get them back online and available to people who wanted to use the material. We also undertook an inventory of UCC oral history projects and wanted to find out what state of digitisation they were at, or where were they housed, or what was being done with them, and also to look at the various kinds of data that were being gathered, particularly within the college at the time. So largely to do a lot of this, we undertook a survey of staff and students in the College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences. I suppose with the Strategic Research Fund, we worked with Sarah, who supported us in terms of preparing the material for archiving. And at this stage, as I said, our website was obsolete. Also very timely and useful for us was the fact that There was appointed in UCC at the time the head of research and digital services, Owen O'Carrigan, and he also kind of recognised our dilemma or our challenge, and also supported us to engage with the Digital Repository of Ireland on the basis of taking the digital material from us and storing it safely and making it available online to those who wish to use it. At the same time, our offices in UCC, and just to recognise that the vast majority of people were keeping data in their offices, that's where data goes if they've nowhere else for it. And in our offices we had the physical material, and because our offices were being renovated, we asked the library, we really need to find a solution. It's not good enough to just let this material lying around unsafe. Can we please try and come up with some solution? So this is what the physical material looked like, because apart, I suppose we did have an exhibition. We also, had different ways. We had floppy disks. We had all sorts gathered over the course of the life of the project. And so we wanted this to be put in a safe place and not to be destroyed. And UCC Archive agreed to take the physical collection, and the Digital Repository of Ireland took the digital collection. It would have been nice maybe to keep the integrity of the collection as a whole, but that we were clear that that wasn't going to be possible really. So this is what we were looking at. So the Digital Repository of Ireland now has the collection from the Irish Women at Work Oral History Project since 2017, and there's a link there to where it's at. The collection contains 37 interviews, 117 images, and then a sub-collection of other photographs that were given to us by a woman we interviewed, Sister Paul, who had taught in Droshan Convent, which was a convent that taught housecraft at that particular point in time. She had some commercial photos and some personal photos and photos that were taken in the convent. And even though we didn't feel they were, at the heart of our collection, they were a kind of subsidiary collection, we thought, well, we'll keep them until there's a better place or a better solution for these photographs. And so they're also there. They're quite remarkable photographs, as I think there's one of them there. There are some really nice photographs as part of that collection as well. And just to point out, I suppose, sometimes we never know how this kind of material is used, but recently an academic got in touch with us saying, could I access the collection of photographs, hoping to use it with their mother in the context of, she had gone to Droshan and she was now an older woman, and, keeping her active and alive and interested and talking about the past and all of that, and it would be a point of connection in the context of talking about these photos. So this gives you a better sense of the material as well. This is a photograph of one woman we interviewed outside her place of work with other women after cycling to work on her bike. Another woman who worked in the telephone exchange. The next piece is a civil service membership union card, and the final one is a picture of Catherine Walsh, who graduated from civil engineering here in UCC. Catherine was the only woman in her class at the time, so in that context, it was nice to interview Catherine, and years later she was also the subject of a women's history salon here in UCC as well, where her family came to see and hear about her life as well. So I suppose it gives another sense of how this material can be used for very diverse purposes. We tried to get as much access as possible to all of the areas of employment the women at this time were engaged in. So we used the census a lot, but also through word of mouth or talking to various people, we got a good sense of where women worked. So all the different areas of work are represented in the collection in terms of all the different dimensions of office work, factory work, teaching, engineering, service provision, retail, work in the telephone exchange, poultry instructing, cheese making, butter making, which were key professions for women at that time, nursing, agricultural labour, farm work and domestic work. So we tried to get a range of different kinds of roles, professional roles and other types of more factory work, service work, etc., and to get a real cross-section of women who engaged in work at that time. I suppose we saw the potential that people could ask new questions of this material, use it to supplement other kinds of data, particularly for historians. And these are some of the various themes and topics, not an exhaustive list, but some of the various areas that we covered in the interviews: good jobs, bad jobs at the time, what jobs paid, unionisation, feelings about work, social life connected to work, emigration, travel, marriage as liberation from work or marriage as domestication. All of those different kinds of dimensions are covered in the interview material. I suppose the significance for us of the Digital Repository of Ireland taking the material is that we're trying to manage the data ourselves and fulfill requests from other people who wanted to use the material, but that was very hit or miss, and it took a lot of work on our part during busy term time trying to teach and do lots of other things. So being able to have a repository where we can just refer people to the data, knowing it's there and accessible to them, is hugely beneficial from our perspective. Also, it allowed us to give, to privilege the orality and the orality, which is kind of crucial in oral history. So that having it digitally available also allowed that to happen. Provided opportunity for data reuse by other students and scholars. The material can be accessed and reached more easily by anybody everywhere in terms of digital access, and particularly as well by communities or family members interested in the material. It facilitates creative and diverse use of the material, ways that we never envisaged, or, when we do get requests, we're always amazed at what people want to use and for what. Satisfies funders and open access requirements. The collection was subsequently aggregated to Europeana, giving it a bigger visibility as well. And also, I suppose, through the DRI, there are more opportunities to publicise the collection, and the DRI have involved us in that process as well. So I suppose from that perspective, it's quite positive for us as well that the collection is getting visibility that we could never give it in that sense. I just want to say a little bit about the inventory of projects, simply because we did get a response back which gave us some insight into some of the challenges that are there for researchers when they gather material. And I suppose clearly one of the bigger challenges is what to do with that material, where to put it, what archive is suitable, what is going to meet people's needs. And very often what we were being told kind of was borne out in this survey of respondents when people gave the reasons why they would love to have something like an archive in the university. They were pointing to things like long-term preservation of material, that they could give communities and others free or better access than we can usually with products from research. And that it could also facilitate research by others. And a lot of the obstacles or challenges they identified, for example, was the lack of a suitable repository for the kinds of material they collected, technical challenges, not having the technical know-how or experience or knowledge they needed to make material available. Sometimes people hadn't got agreement of people to archive from the very beginning, and to go back and negotiate consent or agreement for that purpose would be problematic, and they didn't have a budget for it, things like that. Perceived lack of institutional support, that maybe this kind of material isn't really seen of significant value in the context of the wider university and more pressing kind of research concerns. And lack of knowledge and training was very often what people said, that we don't have the digital skills, we don't have the digital know-how, or we don't know what we're getting into and we can't budget for it, or we can't do it on our own and we don't know what we're getting involved in. Yet people recognise the value of having something like a sound archive, as you can see from the comments here, that it would allow us to preserve material, to share material, and to give projects a life beyond the life of the project when we're doing it as researchers, that others can use this material in diverse ways subsequently. And that very often we're funding projects, we're generating material, but then it comes to nothing if it's sitting in people's offices. That we have an obligation, an ethical obligation, if we're using public money, to share that data and to make it available in as much as we can. So what we learned was problems around technical know-how, technical obsolescence. We ran into those problems. Websites, links get broken. Very often university changed and didn't want the website, and we recognise that that's going to happen. So it's very difficult, I suppose, to know what's going to happen, even in 5 years technologically. So in that context, it's hard to budget and it's hard to plan ahead. Very often people run into problems with budgeting, and we did too. We had run out of money when we ran into our key challenges. So then we were trying to scrape by with little bits of funding here and there, but with no real solutions in that regard. Also, I suppose we were really concerned about what we were doing. There was very few people doing this in the university. We were drawing support from Pierce McHenry and his team of researchers and discussing some of the ins and outs of ethically what we were doing in terms of making material available. But we had very little knowledge and experience ourselves, and it was quite, I suppose, scary to think that you're putting material into an archive and anywhere in the world people can access this material, and even explaining it to the participants, who were all older women, what it was we were doing and getting their agreement for that. So sometimes we were bringing a laptop and showing them this is what this means, because they don't have a sense, not all of them had a sense of the World Wide Web and what that involved in that sense. And also, I suppose, we have, limited knowledge around how to make the material accessible and available and in the most interesting ways. And I think very often oral historians are in that space. They see the value of the material, but how do we get others interested in that, and how do we gauge interest in it, and what might make it more appealing to new audiences, different audiences, older audiences, younger audience, and so on and so forward. So I suppose there are two key things that, from my perspective, are important to think about in the context of archiving. And I think if I was more attuned to these when we did the work, and if we all were, we would have thought through a number of different kinds of dimensions and maybe would have done things differently. And I think going forward, I would as well. But we were very much in a learning process at that time. And I suppose one of those is around kind of ethical issues, and we did have our procedural ethics in order, the things we needed to do, the legalities, those dimensions. We had consent forms, we had release forms, we had all of what we required ethically in that context. But I think we often think about the legalities and the ethics in that kind of narrower sense, but we don't think maybe more broadly of the need to institute. I think what would be useful to us is an ethic of care that we could all share in as such. So rather than focusing just on rights and legalities and those dimensions, looking more at all of our responsibilities, those of us who visit archives and use material, those who are hosting archives, those of us who are, collecting material or creating material, that we're all in a kind of web of relationships and have obligations to each other. And how can we push that ethic of care to its nth degree, I suppose? And what do we need to do that? And I think that is kind of an area that I'd like to explore in future projects, what kind of things we could do to really institute an ethic of care for what we are doing right from the very beginning, and how might it look different than if we just rely on more traditional ethics. And one of the articles I found very useful for getting me to think about these issues, it's not the only one, but Caswell and Sifor's article in 2016, I think, really gets to grips with, the idea of archiving and the kind of ethic of care that's associated with that, and how it binds all of us in kind of relations of mutuality and responsibility to each other, and also how we can all care for the material. And I think that's probably a good way forward in terms of thinking of some of these issues. And the other one that I think is really useful, a concept of sustainable stewardship, that other oral historians have taken on board. It's more broadly in other research fields as well, but in the context of oral history, I suppose it allows us to look at what we could do into the future. And this article by Fernheimer et al. Looks at the Kentucky oral history collection and the ways in which they have made that material available through an online digital tool or platform, and how they have engaged with students who can both add to the collection but who can also come up with new ways of making the collection more appealing, more attractive, and build up the knowledge base around archiving. When we were archiving our material, we edited out the kind of key concerns or issues through our duty of care in that regard. But we didn't have the skills that many of you will have. We didn't have the skills to really clean up those recordings. And we didn't have the skills in the context of, really developed metadata. So I think, again, what a lot of these writers kind of get us to think about is how we could even do metadata differently. It doesn't have to be me as researcher. It could also be the participants in the research project who helped me come up with the best kind of metadata, for example. So how could we ensure that projects have an afterlife and how they can be used pedagogically and in richer ways by students, but also by the communities from which they come from. And I think increasingly as people gather more sensitive material or material from groups or individuals who are concerned about archiving, we will have to find new ways to ensure that we, ensure that people have access, more democratic access to material, and also come up with new ways to make collections appealing to people so that they will be inclined to use them rather than just go out and gather new data from the same people again, but use the collections that are already in existence in new and exciting ways. Okay, so I was going to leave it at that and take any questions or comments.